Welcome to our Thursday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to teach through a series that I've entitled Killing Sacred Cows. I tell you, this is really good, and I've already covered a lot of material. I've talked about the extreme sovereignty of God teaching that I believe is the worst doctrine in the body of Christ. And I countered that in the first week. This week I've been talking about the difference between the Old Testament law and the New Testament grace. And I've been trying to kill this sacred cow that somehow or another we are still under the law. Now this needs a balance, and I apologize in a sense because I would love to balance it, but it could take me a month to put all of this and tell you everything I know. Let me just say that there is a function of the law for the New Testament believer, but it is not us living under it, being condemned by it, thinking that somehow or another we are accepted with God by our conformity to a certain standard. And I hadn't got time to say more than that, but the average Christian is still living under an Old Testament law. Now you may say, well, I don't offer blood sacrifices, animals. I don't observe Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm not under the Old Testament law. But it's like you're headed in the same direction. You're on the same road. You just switched cars. Now you have to, instead of offering a blood sacrifice and a sacrifice on the new moon and the Sabbath and all of these kind of things, now your things are you've got to study the Word an hour a day, you got to pray in tongues an hour a day, you got to go to church, you got to pay your tithes, you got to do this, and if you don't do these things, God won't answer your prayer. That's the Old Testament law mentality. You've just changed the requirements, but it's a law mentality, and most New Testament believers are still living with that law mentality, and it's wrong. It's not right. I use some scriptures, 1 Corinthians 15:56, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7 and 9, talked about that the law strengthened sin. The law was a ministration of death. The law was a ministration of condemnation. It wasn't to set you free, it was to bind you. Look at this in Romans chapter 3 and in verse 19. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law. Before I go on with this, let me just point this out. Did you know that the law was never intended for everybody? The New Testament church was never intended to be under the law. And yet everybody that I've ever known that came up in church has been under the law and under a wrong concept and stuff. Did you know that the Jews were given the law? The Gentiles were never under the law. Man, that's an amazing statement right there. Most people think that, no, this is just for everybody. It was given to the Jews to maintain their integrity and their purities until the Messiah could come, and then he would redeem them out from under the law. Galatians chapter 3 talks about that. So it says here in Romans 3:19, now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. Here's the purpose of the law: to stop your mouth and to make you guilty. What does that mean, stop your mouth? Well, it takes away all of your excuses. Somebody's saying, well, it's that woman that you gave me. That's what Adam did the first time he sinned. It's that woman's fault, and you're the one who gave her to him. He kept passing the buck. And ever since then, people are always saying, but you don't understand. I was raised in a dysfunctional home. I had this happen to me. This person treated me this way. It's the color of my skin. The government doesn't give me enough money. And we have all excuses and reasons. There's people out murdering today. Did you know we've got terrorists today? And there's some people trying to say, well, it's not really their fault. They have been brought up in poverty and they have been abused and they have an opinion of Westerners and I guarantee you, if a person goes out and murders somebody, it's their fault. You can't justify that. But see, the law will take away all of these excuses. The law is for people who are sitting there trying to say, I can't help it. You don't understand. It's in my genes. I have a gene for being an alcoholic. I have a gene for being a drug addict. I was created a homosexual. That's not true. None of those things are true. The law takes away all of your excuses. It's just a proper standard of right and wrong, and it stops your mouth. You can't excuse, you can't explain yourself away. and it makes you guilty before God. That's the purpose of the law, is to make you guilty. If you feel guilty, if you feel shame, if you feel condemnation, you're a person that has been under the law. He goes on to say in the next verse, it says, "Therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." The law gave you knowledge of sin. It didn't give you knowledge of salvation. It didn't give you knowledge of forgiveness, mercy, the goodness, the grace of God. The law gave you knowledge of sin. The law just seeks and finds sin. You know, it would be like a person who, this would be a small comparison, but it's similar, that a person who's a perfectionist, that they come along and maybe you've done a great job and everybody else just thinks you've done a wonderful job, but a perfectionist will come and they will find the one thing you did wrong. If you're cleaning, they will put on the white gloves, and instead of seeing how good everything looks, they will feel underneath something. They will run their gloves across something, just looking for something. That's the law. The law is just going to give you a knowledge of sin. It'll never compliment you and say, boy, it looks great, you've done a good job, but here's something that you could have done better. It'll just always show you how wrong you are. Everybody hates a perfectionist like that. The law was not really a good thing. It accomplished a good thing temporarily. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I could put all of this in its proper balance, but I don't want to miss the point I'm trying to make here. But there is a right use of the law, but overall, it was just to give you a knowledge of sin, to make you guilty before the Lord, to stop your mouth, take away all of your excuses. And then it goes on to say in the next verse, Romans 3:21, "But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifest, being witnessed by the law and the prophets." In other words, this is saying that you can get into right standing with God without keeping the law, without doing all of these things. Even though you've broken the law, you can still be in right standing with God. And there are legalists that just get so offended. No, sir, you not only have to put faith in Jesus, but you've also got to live holy. God won't answer your prayers just based on what Jesus did. You have to go to church. You have to pay your tithes. You have to pray. You have to do this, this, and this. And that's wrong. That's the law. And there are a lot of people that are living by that standard and misunderstanding these things. The law gave you knowledge of sin, but now there is right standing with God without keeping the law. In Romans chapter 7, in verse 5, it says, "For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin, which were by the law," man, that's a radical statement right there. The law gave motion or traction, movement to sin. This goes right along with 1 Corinthians 15:56 that we've already read, that the law strengthens sin. 2 Corinthians 3:7, the law was a ministration of death. 2 Corinthians 3:9, the law is a ministration of condemnation. The law gave knowledge of sin. The law made you guilty. And now here it says that the law gave motion to sin. "For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death." The fruit of the law is death. Not only just physical death, dying and ceasing to be alive, but depression, discouragement, guilt, condemnation, sickness, poverty. Anything that came as a result of sin is the wage. It's a result of sin. It's death. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." So anything that came as a result of death, of sin, is death. And depression, discouragement, anger, bitterness, sorrow, grief, all of these things are the fruit of death. And the law produced that, is what this is saying. In verse 6, "But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held." Let me ask you, what part of being delivered from the law do we not understand? In the very first thing, here it talks about being delivered, shows that the law wasn't really a positive thing. It did accomplish a purpose. It served a purpose, but it was a ministration of death, a ministration of condemnation. It strengthened sin. It made us guilty. It shut our mouth. It showed us the knowledge of sin. There was a reason why those things had to happen, but we are delivered from it, showing that it never was really God's best for us. So now it says in verse 6, "But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. What should we say then? Is the law sin? You know, this is a logical question. Paul had been preaching against the law. I am preaching against the law, that we are out from under this old covenant. We're in a new covenant. And a logical question is, are you saying that the law is sin? No, I'm not saying that. Paul wasn't saying it. He says, God forbid. No, that's not what I'm saying. There is still a function of the law, but it is not as it's been presented. You know, I've been flirting with this and trying to step around it because I don't want to lose the point I'm making, but let me just address this real briefly. I am not under the law in the sense that if I break the law, if I don't live up to its standards, that God is going to reject me, punish me, or any form of that. And I am not under that law. But does that mean then that it has no benefit and that I just should forget it and that I should never read the Old Testament law? I shouldn't think about the Ten Commandments? No, I'm not under the law because every one of us have broken it, and if you don't keep the whole law, you come under the curse if you were trying to relate to God by that. So I don't relate to God based on how well I've conformed to any standard of anything. When the devil comes at me and condemns me, instead of me trying to justify myself and say, wait a minute, I'm better than I've ever been, I'm going to church more, I'm praying more, I'm seeking more, I'm studying the Word more, the moment I start trying to justify myself, I've lost. Because I am not perfect, and He will just show me my imperfection, and then all of my faith will dissipate because my faith was in myself, not in the Savior. So I am not under the law like that. But does that mean that I just ignore the law and it has no bearing on me? No, if I'm in a situation and I'm tempted to not tell the truth, I don't have to just out and out lie, but I'm not going to tell people something. I'm not going to be candid. I'm not going to be open and honest with them because it could work to my own detriment. Is that what God would want me to do? Would He mind me telling a little white lie? Well, I can go back to Exodus chapter 20, and it says, thou shalt not bear false witness. Now, even though God's not going to punish me and I'm not going to be judged, and He loves me even if I go ahead and compromise, but if I want to know, God, what is your right standard? What would you have me to do? I can go back to the law and see what the perfect thing to do is, and that is not to bear false witness. And this is saying not just don't tell a lie, but you could tell a person the truth, but only tell them a portion of the truth and misrepresent something, and that would be false witness. And so I turn back to the law and I say, well, God, thank you that I'm not under this and that you aren't going to judge me and punish me, and thank you that I'm only accepted with you through Jesus. But I know that what you gave in the law, it wasn't sin. It was all perfect. That's the problem. It was perfect and I wasn't. And I can still benefit from it and say, I know that you don't want me to bear false witness, and that'll tell me what I need to do in a certain situation. So I still benefit by the law, but I'm not under it anymore. So this is what Paul is saying. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. So he's saying that there is still a purpose to the law to show us what is right and what is wrong. But where you go wrong with the law is when you think, now this is what God says is right, and so I've got to do this or God won't love me, God won't bless me, God won't move in my life. No, that's wrong. None of us have ever lived up to the law perfectly. And it's not just you do the best you can and then grace makes up the difference. It says over in Romans chapter 11, verse 6, grace, then it is no more of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. And so anyway, you're justified by one or the other, but you can't mix it. You can't say, I'm going to do the best I can, and if it's only 70%, God's grace will make up the rest of it. You can't mix law and grace. You either are justified in the sight of God through faith in Jesus, period, or you are justified by your own works, which can never happen. You can never be perfect. But you aren't justified by a combination of the two. You doing 80% and God providing the other 20%. No, the law gave you knowledge of sin, and there is still benefit for us knowing what God considers right and what God considers wrong, what is righteous and what is sin. There's still benefit to that. But you can't come under this thing of feeling like, God, I've got to do these things for you to love me. God loves you because you accepted Jesus, and that's it. He loves you because He is love, not because you are lovely. Man, this is great, great news. So he goes on to say in verse 8, but sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law, sin was dead. Man, look at this 8th verse. Sin took occasion by the commandment. The commandment gave sin an occasion, an opportunity against us, and it wrought in us all manner of concupiscence. The word concupiscence means uncontrolled, unrestrained lust or desire. Did you know that the law will actually make you lust for the very thing it tells you not to do? I dealt with this earlier in the week, but when you say to somebody, thou shalt not, something in them just rises up and says, bless God, I shall. There's something in us that hates to be told we can't do something. We will do it sometimes just to spite people. I had a minister friend of mine who was listening to my teaching, this exact teaching right here on the true nature of God. He was listening to this in his study, and he saw the point that I was making right here. And he just thought he'd try this out. So he went out into the back door of his house, and he had his son with some friends over there, and they were playing. And they'd been playing for an hour, and everything had been fine, nothing wrong. And he says, you're doing a great job, but whatever you do. And then he pointed at a flower right by the back door, and he says, thou shalt not spit on this flower. And then he went in the house and looked out his study window. He said those kids had been playing for an hour and they didn't even know that that flower existed. But the moment he says, thou shalt not spit on this flower, half of those kids went over and spit directly on that flower, and the others were standing there with their mouth just drooling, wishing that they had enough courage to spit on the flower. But they hadn't even noticed the flower until he says, thou shalt not, and then all of a sudden, man, they lusted for the very thing. That's what this is talking about, that the commandment wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law, sin was dead. Did you know when you go to preaching the law, thou shalt not, you actually make sin come alive? And I know that this is counterintuitive. Most religious people think, no, the way you stop, for instance, a church, the way you get them to start living holy is go to preaching on holiness and preaching against adultery and preaching against this and preaching against it. This is saying just the opposite. You go to preaching the law, you're going to have people start lusting for the very thing you're preaching against. There may be people that never even thought about going and committing adultery, but you go to preaching against it and describing how damaging it is and talking about adultery and stuff, and they'll go to lusting for the very thing that you're preaching against. That's the way that the law works. In verse 9 it says, for I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. Boy, that is one strong statement. Paul here is saying that I was alive without the law once. What does that mean? You know, I could spend an hour on this. I'm going to say this very quickly. But when we were born in sin. Psalms chapter 51, David said, in sin did my mother conceive me. That didn't mean it was an adulterous relationship. It means we were all born with a sin nature. We were by nature a child of the devil. But a little child doesn't have that sin imputed unto them because they haven't participated and yielded to it yet. So if a child dies before they reach what is typically called like an age of accountability, if a child was to die before that time, even though they were born with the sin nature, they still go to be with the Lord. But there comes a time that not only does the child have a sin nature that causes it to be selfish and to do things, but there comes a time that that child not only just does these things naturally, but now they willingly get in and say, I know this is wrong. I know I'm not supposed to do this. I know this is not just mom and dad that I'm violating. I'm sinning against God. And they go ahead and break that. And once they do it willingly, then that sin nature that was there, but it wasn't imputed unto them when there is no law, it was now imputed unto them, held to their account. And from that moment on, if that person dies after they knowingly have participated and crossed the mark, then their sin is held against them. And if they were to die, they'd go to hell. But there is this period of innocency. This is what Paul is talking about, that I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, when the rules and the regulations came, and I broke them intentionally, knowing what I was doing, then he died. Boy, that's an amazing statement right there. Again, I could spend a lot more time explaining that. And in verse 10 it says, and the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. And this is amazing. The commandment doesn't produce life, it produces death. This is exactly what the scripture said over in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. And it says, the commandment deceived me, and it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. The commandment isn't sin. The commandments are perfect. The laws that God put down in the Old Testament law, they are perfect, but we're imperfect. And there was a mismatch. And imperfect, carnal, sinful flesh could never match up to the perfect standard that God had. And so the law wasn't wrong, but the law wound up being an agent of condemnation and guilt to us because we had all come short of it. And like it says right here, the purpose of the law was so that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. In other words, people were dulling themselves. So everybody sins. Everybody does these things. And so I guess if everybody does it, we're all going to be okay. No, God gave the law to make sin so exceedingly sinful, so vile, so bad, that it would make you so sick of yourself and of your sin that you would quit trying to save yourself, and instead you just come to the Lord and say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Man, I heard a story about a guy that went to heaven and had to pass a test to enter heaven. And anyway, he thought he could do it because he was a good person. But after 5 or 10 questions, he only had 2 points. And he had to have 100. And he said, oh, man, if this is what God demands, have mercy on me. And the angel says, come right on in. See, that's what the law was for. For those who were thinking that I'm good, I'm going to be accepted because I'm such a good person. God gave them a test, the law, that just showed them that, man, you are so far short that they despaired of saving themselves. And they said, oh, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And he says, come right on in. That was the purpose of the law.